Welcome to TIDES. Today, we are revisiting a fascinating conversation that started in our last episode with Subu Desaraju, where we explored the importance of data in an era of AI. Subu shared incredible insights into how organizations are leveraging data to transform decision making and to drive innovation. Building on that discussion, we are diving even deeper today into the role of data and unlocking AI's full potential. While generative AI models like GPT and so on are built on vast amounts of publicly available data, the untapped potential lies in private, domain-specific data that organizations have yet to fully leverage. And here's a striking fact. 38% of data leaders cite the scarcity of domain-specific data as a significant challenge to adopting AI solutions. And this is according to a report from Informatica. Now imagine the transformative impact if organizations could bridge this gap. And for this conversation, I'm thrilled to welcome back Subu Desaraju, Chief Commercial Officer at ICE and a seasoned expert in data strategy and analytics. Subu, welcome back to the show, and it's great to have you join us again to expand on this critical topic.
Yeah, no, thank you, Shweta. It's a pleasure to be back. And I couldn't be more excited to discuss the role of data, especially, reliable and trustworthy data in unlocking the potential of AI, right? And especially to its full potential.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a tremendous amount of investment and innovation in hyperscaling, computational power, for example. And we just heard about all the disruption that's happening with now DeepSeek, right? In driving processing efficiency as well as scalability of AI models. But at the same time, I think ensuring that data is reliable, that it's accurate, it's timely, it's consistent and complete is a huge determinant of AI success. And which is why I do think, organizations need to think and rethink actually data reliability. And really excited to have this conversation. So as always, we'll see where this goes because I enjoy my conversations with you, and I can never predict actually how things are going to go. So really excited to kind of be here again and have this conversation.
Likewise. So maybe we can start with, the stat that I used in the beginning. Like if 38% of leaders are feeling like they don't feel like they have enough data or domain-specific data, how do you see that as a significant challenge?
Yeah, I mean, what's reflective is we're actually in the midst of a data deluge. There is an unprecedented amount of data that exists and is being generated today, right? And what's really interesting about the stat you mentioned is that leaders are feeling that there isn't enough data, especially to drive, decision making, and especially utilizing essentially analytics as well as AI to drive decision making. But what I think is underlying that, if you think about it, there's a bit of a dichotomy. I mean, on one hand, we have more data than ever, and yet, I think managers, decision makers, organizations, enterprises are feeling like they don't have either the right data or a good view of data. And this is where I think, the gap between the volume, the velocity, and the variety of data and having accurate, reliable data that actually drives AI, drives analytics, drives decision making is, I think, more crucial than ever before, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I think there's a lot of progress that has been made in, the ability for us to leverage, for example, AI, especially, there's a lot of talk about generative AI, and I think, generative AI, and we can dig into this more, but generative AI relies on public domain and unstructured data to a large extent, whereas discriminative AI, in many respects, actually relies on structured data to a large extent, right? And historical data to be able to kind of do what it does best, which is based on history, being able to predict the future. So, but for all of this, and especially for organizations, I think reliable data has become more important than ever. And I think the success of AI is predicated on reliable, accurate, complete, and timely data, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if we look at organizational data, I would say that ever since organizations started to become more digital organizations, I assume it's safe to say that every organization is a data organization to quite a
100%.
degree.
Yeah.
And data in organizations also exists in two flavors. Like there's active data, which people explicitly share with organizations. It could be like my home address, or, like we run surveys or customer reviews. That's explicit data. And my understanding of implicit or passive data is the digital footprint that customers or employees have in relation to the organization. So when you talk about data reliability and structured data, are you referring to either or a combination of both? What can we unpack under the term of data reliability and structuring the data in an organizational ecosystem?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Shweta. I mean, and I think first of all, yes, there is active and passive data, right? I mean, I actually like to think of it as, people-based data, behavioral data, machine-generated data,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe let's kind of maybe dissect this just for a bit, because I think it is important to our
Yeah.
discussion, actually.
Yeah.
So for example, I mean, when I talk about people-based data, it is exactly as you said. People-based data is who you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can think about it in terms of the data that we share mostly, right? It's self-declared. What you share about yourself as you interact with your friends, your colleagues, with brands, and in the world at large, right? It's who we are actually declaring ourselves to be in many ways, and it's very not only valuable but also verifiable, because it's self-declared in some
Mm-hmm.
respects. And great types of this data reside within brands and enterprises. It's in customer data warehouses, it's in transactional records, it's in essentially survey data, and so on and so forth. And these are all reliable, should be reliable sources of data, but they're often not verified. They're not validated at source. They're not reconciled in a way where I say, yes, all of these data points I have about Shweta, for example, based on her brand engagements with my brand, have not only been verified, but also have been accurately reconciled as being actually Shweta, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
because I need to make sure that, every time you interact with me, that this is actually who you are, that your account number is reconciling with, your identity, and that all of your transactions or your engagements, right, whether that's through the call center or whether that's through a point of sale, are all actually kind of reconciling back to that single identity, which is Shweta, right? And that accuracy is really, really critical, right, for enterprises. And it doesn't really, because of the fragmentation of data and how data is siloed, it doesn't really happen systematically today, right? So that's the people-based data, which we can and should get right,
Yeah.
just as brands, as enterprises. And honestly, I mean, ethically, it's the right thing to do, because if I mistake you for somebody else, I might actually communicate with you the wrong way. I might send you the wrong offer. I might waste money, as an enterprise, in kind of delivering the wrong message at the wrong time to the wrong person. But if I actually have the right data, then I can leverage AI and analytics, not only effectively but also efficiently, to kind of make sure that I'm not wasting money in the wrong places at the wrong time. And there's so many examples of this which we can dive into. But that's people-based data. But then you have to connect people-based data with behavioral data, which is more implicit, to your point, right? Um, Now, behavioral data can be collected by, like web and interaction, on a web and interaction basis, for example. Digital footprints, as you mentioned, wearable devices are also a great example. And, the interesting thing about behavioral data is it actually provides a lot of insights around user habits, preferences, decision-making patterns, which we don't always explicitly essentially state, right? And the thing is, so here's the nuance, like, people-based data tends to be structured, behavioral data tends to be a semi-structured or unstructured. And this is where being able to then also connect and verify, how we validate structured, unstructured data, and then reconcile the connection between them at an identity, at a unique individual level, actually is one of the biggest problems that, I think brands, enterprises face, because it's important for sales, it's important for marketing, it's important for product, it's important essentially to kind of service the customer, appropriately. So this is where, yes, there's also then you layer on top of that, not only connecting the data, verifying it, reconciling it, and making sure that, it's reliable, but then you have to layer on ethical considerations, along with privacy, consent, and data security, right? And before you can feed this data, this connected data, you have to verify, reconcile, and ensure that it's compliant, right? Because you're also exposing yourself to risk. There's so many examples about, for example, Target made a big, snafu by targeting an underage kid with a pregnancy test online. And the dad, incidentally, was using the same computer as the daughter and discovered or kind of inferred that, his daughter might be pregnant. Now, that's an ethical thing. That was up to essentially her to disclose or not disclose. But, the brand inferred, that there was, that essentially kind of, that she may have been pregnant and targeted her with a pregnancy test kit, for example. Right. Now there are so many ethical considerations. Being underage, number one. Number two, ads should not be targeted. Again, this is something that was resolved. So from a brand standpoint, it's not it's not something that I want to expose myself to necessarily. But it's just an example of how ethical considerations might arise. It's actually a publicly stated use case, and this goes back to the age of predictive analytics, not even AI. So when I look at the exposure and the risk of not having reconciled and validated the data, but also essentially verified that you're in compliance with privacy, consent, and data security, you can expose yourself as a brand. So that is something that I think brands, enterprises need to really pay attention to. So it's something that we all need to watch out for.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you point out the nuances and complexity of the data equation in an organization. Because, even if we look at, I'll give you an example. There's a client of ours, they wanted to implement people analytics capability. We helped them select the platform. But even lighting a people analytics platform, I say that it's such a big, heavy lift because you can have many people externally looking into your product, services, being in different types of relationships with an organization. But at least employees, you have control because you have a set number of people who you have to make sense of from explicit and implicit data. But even that is such a heavy lift because even internal employee data is fragmented, it's siloed, it's in different systems, and then the definitions might not feel the same.
Right.
Finance might call headcount something else. Like their definition of headcount might be very different from, let's say, payroll's definition of headcount. So those are the complexities of data. So I'd love for us to unpack from like a greater, broader organizational ecosystem, what kind of complexities and challenges exist in an organizational ecosystem that have to be ironed out early on as organizations embark on this AI journey. Because to me, it doesn't seem like, even though early on it did feel like it, that, hey, why do I need to make sense of my data? I just point AI to it and AI does the sense making part.
So AI can do the sense making part, but it can only sense what it sees in some respects, right? Even if you assume it is artificial intelligence, but even if you kind of apply, we sense what we see, and so does artificial intelligence, right? Human intelligence senses what you see. And it's the same with artificial intelligence, that it senses what it sees. If it sees garbage, it's going to sense garbage, right? Yeah. So, which is where it's the old axiom, it's like garbage in, garbage out. So if you're seeing the wrong data sets, which are unverified, unreconciled, and have fundamental issues in them, AI is going to make the wrong inferences. It doesn't matter, actually, in many ways, what is the model, algorithm, technique you use, because those are technicalities. Mm-hmm. But, and yes, the sophistication and the type of inferences you can make, whether it's generative AI, whether it's discriminative AI, I think could be very different. But at the end of the day, if the data is is not reflective of reality, then we have an issue, and then we have a problem societally, because I think we might cause more damage than good in some respects. And this is where I think that, organizations, I mean, yes, we have to be AI first today, whether it's a product, whether it's an enterprise, whether it's a platform, whether it's a service. I think we have to be AI first, but we also have to recognize that we also have to be data first, and we have to be data reliability first, actually. Because otherwise, yes, I mean, you can kind of infer the right signals from the noise of data, you can connect it. But if you don't verify it, the signals themselves will be wrong. I mean, what you see is not going to be a reflection of reality. And that's where there's a huge risk. I mean, societally, from a business standpoint, from a regulatory compliance standpoint, and at the end of the day, from an ethical standpoint. So,
yeah, absolutely. And you also, Subu, touched on or briefly mentioned the different types of AI.
Yeah.
Gen AI being one of them, and then discriminatory AI. Can you talk a little bit more about them, and what are their unique data needs if we need to light up different types of AI, and for what uses?
Yeah. Happy to touch on it. And again, I mean, I think I've been in the space for a long time, for 25 plus years, but I would by no means, claim to be kind of a modeling expert, right? I mean, I have a background in computer science, but let me actually kind of try to deconstruct, the different types, right? I mean,
and at a high level would be perfect, because where I'm going with this is, we assume that Gen AI is the only type of AI and it's just predicting the next word. How hard can it get? But there are other nuanced flavors of AI for which the data needs might be different. And that's what I wanted to highlight through this conversation.
Absolutely. So, I mean, AI is a very broad category, actually. I mean, there is different levels, essentially, of through which, I mean, AI can be deployed. I mean, and it's a macro bucket, because you have deep learning, you have machine learning, you have self learning, essentially algorithms. I mean, so there's and then you have essentially machine learning as definitely as a subset of AI, but then you have generative and discriminative AI, right? So one of these days, I think I would love to kind of put together maybe essentially kind of a visual that kind of shows the just the categories and how the hierarchy of AI actually pans out. And I'm sure somebody's done that out there already. But at the end of the day, I mean, look, I mean, you can have deep learning. And even within deep learning, I mean, now what's happened is there's a lot of sophistication and specialization even within deep learning. And then, and you have generative AI and discriminative AI. In many ways, I mean, the simplest way to kind of, if the AI is able to generate essentially something that's new, right, based on patterns it's seen. Again, this is based on pattern. It's not, so this time and volume, right? Generative AI actually, to put it very simply, it works on volume to create something new. So what I mean by that is, having seen a lot of patterns, now I'm going to see all the patterns. And when you ask me to create something new within a certain category, right, where I've seen a lot of patterns, I might be able to create something new. Let me give an example of that. If I read 10 books on, I'll just use a generic category that's relevant, right? If I read 10 books recently on how to become a better manager, not only am I going to implement it, right, and practice it, but I might be able to actually write a new book on how to become a better manager, for example, right? And that's essentially what generative AI does. Now, the difference, so then you have discriminative AI, which on the other hand looks at data historically. So it's more temporal, because I need to analyze trends over time or patterns over time. Whereas generative AI can be time agnostic in some respects. It doesn't matter. I mean, if this was 400 years old, this image was generated, or it was generated yesterday, if it still fits into a category of like art or impressionist paintings, for example, and I now have inferred that this is what impressionist paintings look like, I being the AI, then I can, yes, replicate. It's true for humans, it's true for AI actually. Then I can replicate. And if I'm smart enough, I can actually replicate Rembrandt by carefully studying, what a Rembrandt looks like, right? It might be a new. So this is actually how humans learn as well. So this is what generative AI is. If I look at a number of patterns in a certain category, then I can create something new, not just replicate it. Now, discriminative is, it's temporal in the sense that you actually have to go back in history, and more data points you have in history, the better a classification model gets at saying, and even like a predictive model essentially gets at saying that I can predict with confidence that based on what I've seen over the course of 400 years, that this event is likely to occur. So a great example could be if you only gave me like last year's worth of data about the stock market, I have less confidence about telling you what might happen next month, compared to if I took into consideration the last 70 years of data or 100 years of data, right? And say, well, based on the volatility in the market, based on the buying and selling patterns, I think this is going to happen, and tell you that with 99% confidence, right? That's not generative. That is essentially you are looking at you're discriminating essentially between different data points and saying what is the likelihood of something happening, for example, or saying with certainty that this fits into a certain pattern, right? So that is what essentially discriminative AI does. So at a fundamental level, like I said, there's a variety of modeling techniques, which they're experts, like essentially, I used to code a while ago and I don't anymore. But that's the fundamental, essentially kind of the difference.
Yeah, no, thank you for going deep on those two. And does every organization need to understand these different variations of AI, and then carve out their data strategy? Like, where I'm going with this is, what would be the typical use cases of discriminative AI? And is the prep, if let's say, for example, an organization has a lot of use cases in that particular type of AI, what would their data setup approach be compared to an organization that probably doesn't have as many use cases to implement that flavor of an AI? Is there a difference between the two?
Oh, there's 100% difference between the two, right? And what's interesting about, I think, what you're pointing out is, look, generative AI today largely relies on public domain information, right? And like I said, because just by definition, and if there's a lot of public domain information, yes, businesses and enterprises can benefit significantly from generative AI. I'll use an example, right? For lawyers to kind of go through all of the historical cases and synthesize essentially how a verdict was called, or how the jury made a call, or how the judgment was done, the verdict eventually, the outcome, and how essentially, I think the arguments essentially kind of influence the verdict. You can span through historical like court records as well as documents, and use generative AI to say, well, if this, then essentially kind of if you give me a certain set of criteria, I can give you an outline of how to actually kind of present this case in the court, for example, right? And so even legal documents, precedents. Today I think in law, you're seeing actual. It's being used in multiple places for sure, but I'm just using one example. It's being used to influence essentially kind of and expedite, because typically paralegals go through a lot of historical documents, right? So you're now automating that and kind of synthesizing essentially kind of key takeaways from historical cases, precedents, and so on and so forth. And now you can kind of present it to the attorney, and that shortens essentially the entire process, right? But it is generative in nature. It's patterns, right? It's pattern based. Now there's a similarity, like I said, in that respect between generative and discriminative, but enterprises typically they're not relying on public domain data. Like if I am trying to sell you, essentially, I mean, let's take an example of you applying for a credit card at a bank. Now, that is based on largely private data or confidential data that you need to be really careful with, that doesn't exist in the public domain. You may be an existing customer of the bank. You may not be an existing customer of the bank. If you're not an existing customer of the bank, I mean, I want to essentially assess your credit score, look at your, essentially, I would go to a number of private data sources to assess, what are your liabilities, what's your income, so on and so forth. And that data needs to be validated, verified, accurate, for me to make an assessment of whether to kind of, give one a credit card or not, right? I mean, issue a credit card or not. So like credit scoring and risk assessment, I mean, relies on confidential private data at scale. And this is where discriminative data actually comes in, which is why I think from a business standpoint, right, when it comes to utilizing data that is that needs to be not only secure and private and confidential, but needs to be reliable. Have we validated essentially the data that's arriving from 5 different sources, right? I mean, from from my personal information that they may have sourced from a credit company, right? My information they may have sourced from my car loan, from my home loan, from my banks, and my employer around my income, for example. Now, all of this data is coming from different sources. If I don't validate it at source, ensure, and to your point, you mentioned this before, is like it's not even in the right format. Okay, then it doesn't. Then the systems don't process the data correctly. And they might essentially, if you have bad data, that then affects essentially all of the modeling, analytics, and the AI. So I can't emphasize the importance of validating data at source, making sure that across different data hops, now data goes across multiple hops in an organization and is usually not reconciled, or the transformations are not verified, which means as I move from one format to the other, for example, if I'm not making sure the data has been not only transformed, but also has been verified to be complete, accurate, and consistent, then, it's either not representative, and your models are going to make the wrong inferences. So this is where I think discriminative AI, in my point of view, has the biggest potential to transform enterprises and businesses. But discriminative AI is also way more reliant on reliable data, right? Than generative AI in some respects, which tends to be unstructured, and private domain data tends to be much more structured or semi-structured, effectively.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So for organizations, let's say, that are not very high on their data maturity journey and are starting early, but want to tap into this potential of AI for their organization, what would you suggest would be their starting point, or what would be like your guideline or a framework that you can share with organizations that are not very data mature,
Yeah.
so that they know where to start and how to get going on this journey?
Yeah, no, I think so. Make data a business differentiator, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is systematically invest, not just in the data infrastructure, not just in the data processing, but in data reliability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because look, I mean, we've come to a point in the maturity of like software development where applications are tested at scale, right? I mean, before a release, there is comprehensive testing of applications to ensure that, from a UI, from a functionality, from a usability standpoint, there's a plethora of processes and platforms that solve to make sure that the user experience is right, that the functionality works, and so on and so forth. But we're so underinvested across organizations and enterprises in ensuring that the same rigor is actually applied to data. And that is why I'll tell you, I'm an analyst, and a modeler's job is one of the hardest jobs in the industry today. And having led teams in the space, because we're underinvested from a data reliability standpoint. And I think that is the biggest priority that enterprises essentially kind of need to, essentially priority and undertaking that enterprises need to take. Because if the data is not accurate, clean, verified, reliable, then they're exposing themselves to a lot of risk, actually.
Mm-hmm. So where should an organization start? I'm asking selfishly from somebody who's in, let's say, HR or is responsible for internal employee data. Like, should they set up a new capability, or if they have team of people who are data savvy, should they look at how do they go about solving for data reliability is where I'm going. Is it like a more end user focused approach? Do you start with what are the different sources of data generation sources in your organization? How do you store data in one place? How do you make sense of it? Like, what should that process be like?
Yeah, for 100%, right? I mean, so first of all, I mean, you should know the data sources, like they should be codified, right? You should know the expectation in terms of how the data is going to arrive when it does arrive, for example, or how it's being sourced and in what format. And then you have to verify that it's complete, it's accurate, and it confirms to your expectations. Because if it doesn't, then what happens is there's downstream processes that will fail, and which leads to essentially kind of data defects and issues downstream. So the first step is knowing your sources, knowing the expectation, in terms of how the sources are going to deliver the data, for example, and that's critical. I'll use an example from healthcare, right? A lot of healthcare data partners, media platforms, all deliver data to either a brand or an agency, as an example, right? But the data comes in so many different formats. It's not standardized, and often even if you publish the standards, the delivered data is not in compliance with the standards. This is true in the agency and healthcare space. It's true in the media world. It's true even in CPG and other categories, in finance, for example, right? A huge issue. And so if you're not validating the data at source for compliance with expectations, whatever that might be, and I don't want to get too technical, but whether it's a file format, it's a schema, it's a it's a key value pair, and if it's not in the right format, then what happens is you can build the best downstream processes to process, integrate, and connect the data, which are all critical capabilities that organizations need to have. But if you're not verifying the data at source and validating it, you're already losing. The second piece is data goes through multiple transformations. So I might get like I'll go back to the banking example just for simplicity right now. So I have source data about a prospect who's applying for a credit card from 5 different data sources. But I need to not only connect that data, but also transform it so now I can integrate it into one single unified, entity, for example, or record. What organizations do is they develop something called as data pipelines or transformations, and then they kind of not only process and connect the data, but they also transform it. So it actually is now one single record as opposed to 5. Now, if that is not done accurately and there's defects in that process, then you're going to be, again, missing data. You're going to have incomplete information. It may not be accurate, right? And that affects essentially, again, the outputs, whether that's business intelligence, whether that's analytics, whether that's AI. And lastly, you have applications that consume it. So are you ensuring, for example, that there's business rules in place, whether it's from a privacy compliance standpoint, or it is just from a customer standpoint, for example, right? Simple examples I'll give you, Shweta, where for example, should I give you this discount or not? That has a material effect on business outcomes. Can I target you with this ad or not? Are you underage or overage, right? Which is basically kind of a privacy and ethics issue, right? Can I, can I actually invoice you, right? Or ship this to you? If it hasn't been invoiced, then, I shouldn't be shipping, something to you if the invoice hasn't actually cleared, right? So, or the payment hasn't cleared, for example. So there are several ways in which incomplete, inaccurate information can influence business outcomes, whether that's from a revenue, profitability, compliance, or risk standpoint, right?
Mm,
Or an ethical standpoint, for that matter.
mm,
So, which is why I think ensuring that you're validating data at source, you're, reconciling and ensuring that all of your data transformations have been done accurately, and then ensuring that business rules and validations are in place. I mean, I would say the three key capabilities that organizations really need to look at when it comes to data reliability. And it is the underpinning for
mhm,
successful AI initiatives.
mhm, mhm. And if data reliability exists as a problem today, that means that couple of things, like maybe organizations didn't see the value in solving for it, and they didn't invest time and energy and resources in it. Two, it was really hard to do. That's why it's not been done so far. So would you say that given where we are at now with AI advancements, yes, data is important to leverage AI fully and advance and innovate and go to the next stage. But would you say now to solve for data reliability as a problem is also easier because new tools, new ways of thinking about it have come into the equation? Is AI helping in that sense as well?
100%, right? 100%. I mean, and so this would be a plugin actually for our product,
I
because.
didn't do it intentionally.
But now that you kind of you've laid it up for me, Shweta, so I can't help it. But no, platforms like ours, I mean, take an AI first approach to ensure that data is not only tested at source, but across the entire data lifecycle and certified, right, for business intelligence, for analytics, for AI, and at the end of the day, for decision making. Now, there's so much. And going back to your earlier question, yes, I do think organizations are underinvested in data because I don't truly think we've ever grasped, except for folks like myself who've grown through the process, so to speak, over the course of 20 plus years. I mean, 27 years myself. Actually, you don't. I think we singularly, and especially, I think I hate to say this, but in many ways, I mean, I think there's a question of data literacy across, the leadership of organizations, and I think the complexity of data is often underestimated, and hence, and hence there's an underinvestment in ensuring, things like data reliability, right? I think we've recognized over the course of the last 10 years and simplified how data is managed and even connected. But I don't think we've become as sophisticated in terms of ensuring that data is reliable, actually. And this is where I do think AI can play a huge role, actually, not only in transforming the net outcomes, but also ensuring that the data itself is clean, reliable, and validated. And which is why, I mean, we are taking an AI first approach. I think, there is a lot that can be done in terms of testing and monitoring the data at scale through AI to ensure things like validation at source. I mean, reconciliation across different hops and business rules validation, right? I mean, if I think about those three key areas, and those are exactly the types of features we're embedding in our platform to help enterprises. But I also think that agentic AI is the future, right? I mean, as enterprises look ahead, and the AI race is actually shifting the equation from automation to autonomy. You know,
Mm,
and that's where I think agentic AI can play a huge role. So our vision actually is that even from a data reliability standpoint, that agentic AI will actually help you identify where your risks are, what's going wrong across your data value chain and your ecosystem, and really kind of make sure that organizations are ready for AI through data reliability and putting data reliability first.
yeah, that's a really important point. Like, if we have to trust an AI agent to make decisions on our behalf, it better get the right and accurate, reliable data to make those decisions. Otherwise, I mean, not only will it make wrong choices, but the ripple effect long term will be that we will lose trust and credibility in AI autonomously working on our behalf. So, and then yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting angle actually. Do you still see human in the loop when agents come into the mix?
100%, because look, I mean, I think the human-machine interaction is, I think, going to be critical to the evolution of AI and to the evolution of humanity in at large. I do believe that, right? I mean, there's we may have talked about it a bit last time, but I think there's a lot of doomsday scenarios being projected about, like, what happens to people when AI takes over. And I, for one, I'm a firm believer in human intelligence, number one, right? And that the creator, the created cannot surpass the creator. Okay, now if we get philosophical for a second, right? I mean, the created cannot surpass the creator. I mean, if it was, um, then we would be God, right?
Yeah.
And we often mistake ourselves for being so, but that's a whole different conversation, Shweta. And I don't, I think, yes, I mean, there's always going to be human machine interaction. And I think AI will get better. I think there's a lot of problems for us to solve. And AI can help solve for those problems all the way across from, making sure that we have good data to leveraging that we have great business outcomes. That at the end of the day, I mean, the goal of this whole mission is to kind of make us better, make the world a better place. And hopefully we are able to leverage, I mean, the right tools, the right technology, I mean, to get there.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, I know you already spoke about AI agents, but I'm going to still ask this question. Do you see any other exciting or critical trends in the world of data and AI that organizations should prepare for? And how can they position themselves to take full advantage of it?
Yeah. No, as I mentioned, I think Agentic AI is going to be revolutionary. But at the same time, I mean, I think if we deviate, yes, I mean, I think there's going to be huge advances in terms of, I think, listen, I mean, I think Moore's law, right? Gordon Moore at Intel, I mean, he'd actually predicted the exponential rise of computing power in some respects, right? I think AI is going to kind of follow a similar path, where the power and capability of AI is going to more than double probably every 12 months, actually, at the rate at which we are seeing. I mean, and there's going to be different. I mean, there's going to be efficacy, there's going to be efficiency. Somebody's going to focus on computational power, somebody's going to focus on essentially how much more can I get from that computational power. But at the end of the day, I think there is that aspect of being people first, right? Because look, businesses work for people. Yes, people work for businesses, but businesses essentially exist because we need to function as a society. If businesses make a shit ton of money, excuse my language, but it's not benefiting people at large, the cause of business itself becomes diluted in some respects, right? I mean, capital needs to serve people, and people, yes, I mean, serve in cause of capital, but it goes both ways. So AI needs a purpose as well.
That's right. Why? What a way to wrap up the conversation today. Well, as always, you bring so many insights to our audience, so thank you. And this brings us to the end of today's conversation. Subu, thanks again for joining us and giving us your time and sharing your incredible insights on the role of data and data reliability in driving AI innovation. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Shweta, for having me again.
And for our listeners, we hope that this discussion gave you valuable perspectives on how to harness your data and leverage it strategically for AI innovation. Remember, the journey starts with understanding your data ecosystem, breaking down silos, and ensuring ethical and actionable use of information. And data reliability, like Subu said, is the key. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share it with others who you think might find it valuable. Until next time, keep exploring how AI and data can transform the way we work, innovate, and grow. Thanks for tuning in.